Um, Today's session is entitled Building Partnerships Across Society to Protect Civic Freedoms and Democracy, Experiences of the Business Network on Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders. So in today's session, we will explore the private sector's unique position to work with civil society organizations to uphold and defend civic freedoms, democracy, and civic participation. The organizers of this session have been working together for years, exploring this intersection of business action and protection of civic space. And jointly, we have been making the case that companies and civil society benefit from the same essential elements and exist in a shared space that they have an interest in jointly defending. We're also making the case that businesses are directly affected by increased autocratization and the weakening of civic space surrounding their business operations, and that corruption, lack of transparency, and suppression of public debate can actually also lead to a less stable and profitable environment for business. In this session, we will first hear from Bennett Freeman, a leader and standard setter for responsible business and investment who has co-founded multiple stakeholder initiatives and coalitions focused on extractives, technology, and apparel sectors. Bennett Freeman is also the lead author of Shared Space Under Pressure, Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders, and currently associated with Chatham House. Bennett will explain how in recent years, international standards have developed that elucidate the responsibility of companies to respect human rights, and that includes civic freedoms on which civil society is predicated. And he will also share how boundaries between corporate responsibility, I'm just admitting a few more people, how the boundaries between corporate responsibility and geopolitics have been starting to progressively blur. So Bennett will comment on how there is actually growing appetite for companies and investors to get involved in initiatives against repression, against authoritarianism, and the ones that support democracy and civic space. After Bennett speaks, we will make some space for questions for Bennett, as we want this to be an interactive session. I know there's not many of you, so we can really have an intimate and open debate in which you can share your thoughts and opinions. We will then turn to Sierra and Pam. Sierra Leder is the human rights lead and advocacy strategist at the B team, whereas Pam Wood is human rights and responsible supply chain manager at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Pam and Sierra will speak about the Business Network on Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders, which offers a unique space where business, investors, and civil society, as well as human rights defenders, come together to exchange on key topics on the human rights agenda, openly and frankly, with a special focus on civic freedoms and defenders. And finally, taking into account the experiences of this network, we will turn to a discussion with you on how corporate action in support of civic space can stretch beyond a cluster of already engaged multinationals, and how it could potentially tackle wider topics of authoritarian resurgence. So thank you all for being here again, and I will first turn to Bennett. So Bennett, global governance was until recently primarily the domain of states, and now we see the private sector really increasingly involved, see them speaking up for the protection of civic freedoms, civic space, democracy. Could you walk us through this evolution and its key moments? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. That's a tall order, but I'll try to tackle it in the next 15 minutes and move to questions and our other panelists. And thank you for the introduction and the chance to join. And Anna has been a close colleague now for 5 years, working together on exactly this agenda. Yes, it's true that nation states have been the prime movers in global governance, have essentially set the standards and rules of the road in the international community for the last 3/4 of a century, since the end of World War II, and for the most part for decades, if not centuries before that. But we've seen an evolution in global governance in the last quarter century or more, concurrent with the acceleration of globalization, the rise of the internet, a more connected world, where civil society and business have played increasingly formative roles in defining and driving agendas, often born of conflict, of conflicting interests, but also increasingly over the years in many ways in the environmental sustainability space, labor and human rights, corruption, rule of law, collaboratively finding common ground, finding common interests. And one of the manifestations of that common ground, as Anna's alluded to, has been the emergence over the last 2 decades of various multi-stakeholder initiatives in the technology arena, extractives, labor, supply chain labor, and other important touch points, particularly for labor and human rights, insofar as they intersect with business. But this collaboration, this convergence of interests and values has come under immense strain in the last half dozen years, in particular, as we've seen a real suppression of civic space around the world. We've seen crackdowns on freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, the real core civic freedoms that are the essential underpinnings of civil society. At the same time, unfortunately, we've also seen, and going back decades, efforts, direct and indirect, by business, unfortunately, to constrict civic space, or at least to be complicit in government efforts to constrict civic space. We've seen that particularly in the rise of what many are aware of, or SLAPP suits, trying to silence NGOs and human rights defenders who are critics of individual governments. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center, with which Anna is a key member, has done an extraordinary job of documenting and explaining now the attacks we've seen, both physical and judicial, in which business has been complicit against civic freedoms and human rights defenders. And this is all part of a much broader phenomenon that we all see, and many of us feel in our own countries around the world, and that is a trend towards autocratic governments operating with greater impunity, democratic governments, even especially half a dozen or more major democratic governments themselves becoming illiberal in various ways, being disrespectful of rule of law, themselves constricting civic space. And that trend, unfortunately, accelerated during the last 2 years of the pandemic, as many governments, both autocratic and democratic alike, views the pandemic as a pretext to suppress political opposition and to constrict civic space. The list of countries is too long to even cite the dozen or even 24 major examples. We've seen it around the world. And I should also note that there's no longer such a neat distinction between democratic and autocratic states. We have democratic states that are increasingly illiberal, authoritarian, populist, nationalist. And we also have seen how the suppression of civic freedoms, the constriction of civic space, is often the first catalytic step towards suppressing democracy itself. So business is a big actor here, a critical actor, both on the negative side in terms of all too often having been complicit in efforts to constrict civic space and to even attack human rights defenders over many years, but is also emerging at the same time in fits and starts as a positive contributor. And that's really where a lot of the work that Anna and the Sierra, who you'll hear from, and others who put together the Business Network for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders have focused their efforts. I've worked in close association with them now for 5 years in trying to get business to stop complicity, stop attacks on defenders, on civic space, and really to pivot towards consistent efforts to support civic space and defenders around the world. There's a core concept here that we developed several years ago, and Anna referred to the report shared space under pressure, business support for civic freedoms and human rights defenders, in which she played a major role. And the notion of the shared space is very straightforward. It's that civil society and business should share values and interests around rule of law, accountable governance, civic freedoms, and human rights. That those are, of course, the essential underpinnings, the enablers of civil society itself. They're the underpinnings, of course, of democracy. But they are also at the same time, or should be at the same time, the essential underpinnings of sustainable, profitable business and investment environments. And I think that for too long, for decades, that business has actually thrived on the shared space without really recognizing it, acknowledging it. And what we're seeing now, finally, belatedly, but quite purposefully in many sectors by many companies, are efforts, again, in fits and starts, inconsistent, but overall net positive efforts to understand, support, and defend this shared space. What I'm going to do now in the remainder of my remarks for the next 10 or 12 minutes is to sketch very, very briefly first several of the main frameworks that have emerged to guide business as it tries to support the shared space of civic freedoms, accountable governance, and also to give a few quick examples of both policy commitments that have been made by companies in different sectors, and a couple quick examples of actions taken by companies to support civic freedoms and shared space. And I'll conclude with a quick challenge to all of us to think as to whether the Western business exit from Russia might be the basis of a new paradigm for what I call geopolitical corporate responsibility. I'm going to be very quick walking through these themes, but I hope that it will frame then the rest of the discussion in ways that are challenging and provocative. So first, quickly, on the frameworks to guide business, Anna and I have already mentioned the first and really still the most comprehensive, but not the only framework, and that is the report Shared Space Under Pressure, Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders. And that report was commissioned and published by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center together with International Service for Human Rights. And I had the privilege of working for a year as the lead author, and having subsequently presented the report, about 100 times in different fora, in person and virtually around the world. And the Shared Space Under Pressure report is essentially a decision-making framework for multinational corporations to decide whether, and if so, how, they should act to support and defend civic freedoms and human rights defenders in different circumstances around the world. And a couple of key points made in the report. First is the report draws a distinction between what we call the normative responsibility of companies to act in certain circumstances, the normative responsibility tied directly to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, calling on companies to act when they cause, contribute, or directly linked to human rights harms or threats, including against human rights defenders. A second key point made in the report is that when there is not necessarily a normative responsibility to act, there's still a discretionary opportunity to act in certain circumstances. And that's where the business case and also the moral choice come into play, where companies have to really grapple with various trade-offs and dilemmas as to whether they should take a stand. Another key point made in the report is that there's a spectrum of actions that companies can take. And I think often we think that companies always should be speaking out. And the report really recommends that companies indeed speak out publicly in certain situations, but also engage privately, quietly first in others, particularly in some delicate situations involving human rights defenders at risk. There's no one size fits all. but we emphasize a pragmatic flexibility as to how companies should act. And then the final key point in the report is to encourage companies to weigh not only the risks of action, blowback from host country governments if they take a public stand versus the risks of inaction, long-term payback, if you will, from stakeholders internationally, locally, local communities who really feel that companies are fundamentally opposed to them. There are trade-offs on both sides, both the risks of action and inaction, and we emphasize that both need to be assessed carefully. Moving on to the next main framework, and more briefly, but significantly, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights published last June of 2021 its own guidance on business and respect for human rights defenders. And that report is really complementary and mutually reinforcing with the Shared Space Under Pressure report. It references the shared space framework multiple times, and I should say that in putting together the shared space report, that we consulted people on the UN Working Group, as well as the late John Ruggie, quite extensively to be sure that we were fully aligned with the UN guiding principles. So that UN Working Group guidance is significant, and it emphasizes to a greater extent than the shared space framework both the due diligence that companies should undertake to understand risks against defenders, but also how they should be prepared to ensure or even directly provide access to remedy when defenders are threatened or attacked. So that's a significant piece. There are two other secondary sources here that I think are significant to flag, both again also easily identifiable online. First is a report published by Chatham House in February last year, February 2021, called The Role of the Private Sector in Supporting Civic Space. And the report addresses essentially what its title says it does. It's a distillation of several events and a number of interviews, largely with multinational corporates, trying to get their perspectives, and is very complementary, again, both to the shared space framework and anticipates some of the points made in the UN Working Group framework. And then finally, and not least, the UN Global Compact published a report last June that's a business framework for SDG 16, Sustainable Development Goal 16, with which many of you are familiar. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. And that report, quite comprehensive and detailed, makes the case that peace, justice, and strong institutions are essential for business, essential for investment, and that both companies and investors can play and do play critical roles in supporting peace, justice, and strong institutions, both within nation states, but also among nation states in the international community. I highly commend that report as well. So those are the main frameworks that really guide companies to make policy commitments and to take actions. So in the policy arena, we've seen the emergence in the last couple of years of policy commitments and statements made publicly by a number of major multinational corporations. And I always want to credit Adidas first for having come out with a human rights defenders policy back as early as 2017. Maybe it was even in 2016. I need to check the date. But they were the first mover. But in the last couple of years, there have been a whole range of multinationals across sectors who have made such policy commitments, some directly and informed and inspired by the shared space framework, others generated from other sources, but all consistent with the shared space framework and with the UN guidance, even if some predated the latter. And so I'm not going to get into the details of the policy commitments, but I'll just name quickly just some of the major companies in different industries that have adopted policies addressing human rights defenders specifically, as well as in most cases, civic freedoms, and have committed themselves in most cases to zero tolerance, as they put it, for complicity in attacks against defenders, and commit themselves in many cases to support civic freedoms where they can. So those companies include H&M in the apparel sector, Shell and BP in extractives, Novartis in pharmaceuticals, Facebook among the social media platforms, and there are also forthcoming policies I'm aware of coming from Total Energy, also in the extractive sector, as well as from Unilever in agribusiness and consumer goods. And there are a number of others as well, but that's a good cross-section of policy commitments that we've seen in the last year or two from major multinational corporations. And it's important also that these companies develop, as several of them have or in the process of doing, internal guidance to accompany the publication of these policy commitments to really help guide staff around the world, operations managers, to make decisions as to whether, and if so, how to engage on different issues and situations. And then we'll go quickly here from the policy commitments to the actions, because that's of course where the action is. It's words and policies are one thing, actions and impacts are even more important, although the two are closely connected. So I'll mention quickly a few examples in the last 2 or 3 years of significant corporate efforts, some by individual companies, some collectively by groups of companies, several in multi-stakeholder initiative contexts that have directly tried to support civic freedoms and what we call the shared space. A couple of examples in the apparel sector. One are the efforts over the last 3 or 4 years of major global apparel brands working through the Fair Labor Association based in Washington and the Ethical Trading Initiative based in London to support freedom of association for garment workers in Cambodia. And that initiative came in the wake of Cambodian security forces shooting live ammunition on striking workers. And the companies and those two multi-stakeholder initiatives came together and said, this is unacceptable. You've got to respect freedom of association, and what's at stake is our willingness to continue to source significantly from Cambodia. Another example, and one that I've been closely involved with now for 14 years as a co-founder of the Cotton Campaign, has been the efforts of major apparel industry associations and apparel brands to end massive state-imposed forced labor in Uzbekistan. And that effort, together with efforts by labor and human rights advocates and trade unions and responsible investors, has led actually finally to the elimination of forced labor, state-imposed forced labor in cotton in Uzbekistan. And I had the privilege of joining colleagues in Tashkent in March in announcing the end of a dozen-year boycott that had been joined by 330 European and North American apparel brands. So that's an example of collective action in the apparel sector. Technology has been another arena where we've seen some positive efforts by companies, and I would single out here efforts to oppose network shutdowns in different countries around the world. Network shutdowns, often for political reasons, that have had just ruinous effects on commercial activity, on economies that can be seen even in GDP drops in a single year, but also just devastating effects on not just political opposition, but on civic freedoms and civil society itself. And I've been heartened to see now, going back 4 or 5 years, the Global Network Initiative, GNI as many know it, taking stands to oppose network shutdowns around the world. Then we've also seen several examples of companies and investors making statements opposing coups and crackdowns on civic freedoms in individual countries. We've seen statements by corporations, both foreign multinationals and local based companies in Myanmar last February of 2021, appealing for the immediate release of political detainees in the wake of the coup there. And the Business Network for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders, I recall, was involved in the formulation of that statement together with the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business. Anna, with the Resource Center, and I, on behalf of the Conflict Risk Network, working together with many others, produced, including the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, produced an investor statement in early December appealing for the restoration of the democratic transition in Sudan. And a number of investors on a transatlantic basis at least signed that statement. Unfortunately, as in Myanmar, the situation remains tense and progress has not been made, but at least foreign investors weighed in there. We've also seen very significantly, and the exit of Western business from Russia. I'll return to that in my conclusion in a couple of minutes here, but there was just a couple of weeks ago an investor statement not only condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but calling on companies themselves to apply what we call enhanced due diligence to ensure that they are not contributing to human rights abuses, harms in the conflict situation that is occupying still the headlines here around the world every day. So those are some examples. I did not mention specific instances of companies intervening to protect human rights defenders, and I didn't for a significant reason, and that is that there are a number of efforts, but almost all of them are done quietly and, in my opinion, for the most part, necessarily behind the scenes that are not public. There was significant public efforts on the part of Finnish and other Scandinavian companies several years ago to defend in the courts the British anti-trafficking investigator, Andy Hall, who had exposed modern slavery in the Thai seafood industry. There have been other examples going back a couple of decades, even a couple I was involved with when I was still at the State Department in the late 1990s, of companies even helping to get political prisoners out of certain countries, and also to talk to host country governments about individual human rights defenders at risk and to warn against any attacks of them. There are a few examples on the public record, but again, mostly done quietly behind the scenes. So I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes here, but I just want to make clear that it is not always easy. In fact, it's rarely easy for multinational corporations to take these stands. You know, they have dilemmas that they have to grapple with. They've got competing interests. They have to manage relationships with host country governments with which they do significant business. They have to, of course, at the same time, manage relationships with stakeholders, global, national, local. They have to deal with, in too many countries, legacies of distrust, as we called it in the shared space report, legacies of distrust on the part of civil society and local communities that view business as, frankly, enemies, not as adversaries, or at least as opponents, not as partners. We have to break through that. It's very, very hard. And I've been struck by some of my recent work touching on Colombia, on how stubborn that legacy of distrust remains, how severe violence remains in that country, political violence, and especially violence against human rights defenders. They're incredibly hard to overcome. And then, of course, there's the China problem, where I think we all are aware that it's one thing to take a stand in Uzbekistan, a country, significant country in Central Asia, 35 million people and growing, important regional player, but another thing entirely to take a stand that will end up crossing swords with the government of China. And we've seen flashpoints there where companies have taken stands. And I think we're all aware of the suppression of the Muslim minority population, the Uyghurs in Western China, and not least massive forced labor there in cotton, and to a lesser extent now the solar industry. And there we saw companies like, especially H&M, not just sever, as did many other apparel companies, sever supplier links to companies that they were sourcing from in Xinjiang, but maintaining their public opposition, at least on their websites, to forced labor globally, and specifically and explicitly to opposition to forced labor in Xinjiang. Well, H&M's payback, as some recall from last early spring, late March, early April, was essentially being canceled in China, at least online. They still got a dozen or so stores open, but they were essentially canceled online, knocked off the big e-commerce platforms, and they were subjected to huge abuse and attack on Chinese social media, no doubt largely orchestrated by the government of China. The China situation is extremely challenging. We saw the pressure that corporate sponsors of the Beijing Olympics came under in connection with the Winter Olympics just several months ago. Those issues are not going to go away, but we see at the same time this, I think, historic and unprecedented exit of Western companies from Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine. And yes, the exits have been for a number of reasons, many of them reputational. Some would deride them as just PR gestures, but in my experience working with multinational corporations around the world now for decades, it's an historic, unprecedented exit. Yes, there are some inconsistencies, there are some gaps, but nonetheless, I think that what we've seen is absolutely extraordinary. And I've been thinking in the last couple of months as to whether this Western business exit from Russia may lead us in some ways to a new paradigm of what I call geopolitical corporate responsibility, where companies will understand and act on the basis of that understanding that they have a fundamental stake in the rule of law, both within and among nations, that they have a fundamental stake in an international rules-based order, that they have thrived, prospered, profited on the basis of that rules-based international order, that they depend on it, and therefore they need to support and defend it. At the same time, in my view, this is not just a call on companies to support what many have called the liberal international order, even with all of its merits. It also was distorted in too many ways by the so-called neoliberal emphasis on deregulation and free markets at almost all costs that led, at least indirectly, to the global financial crisis of 2008 and a deepening inequality in too many countries, both rich and poor, around the world. So geopolitical corporate responsibility, I think, needs to be conjoined with a commitment to diminishing inequality and to promoting sustainability, and that means attacking the climate crisis. The international community and its rules and rule of law are essential. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient without political will to also address these fundamental challenges. So I'm hoping, and I end on this hopeful note, that there will be a greater recognition of shared space, both in micro situations where individual human rights defenders and NGOs, journalists, trade union leaders are under threat, in national situations where civic freedoms are being suppressed, but also globally, where international rule of law, national sovereignty and integrity, human rights are at stake, and that companies can recognize and embrace their responsibility to support a better world. Thank you.
Thanks, Bennett, for such a hopeful ending, but also just for taking us through a very all-encompassing history that really sort of reads as a history of the business and human rights movement in many ways, and has led us to this moment in time where clearly the links between civil society space and business protection of it are very much at the forefront of everyone's minds because of what they mean to democracy and potentially even violent conflict. So thank you so much for taking us through all of this. Before I move us to Sierra and Pam, I just wanted to see if there are any questions from those of you that have joined us. I don't see any in the chat right now yet, but if you do have any, please put them in the chat, or we're a small enough group that you can also just raise your voice and come in. I'll wait for a second, and if not, I do have a few questions that I'd be very curious to ask Bennett as well, but let me see first if there are some that come in.
Hi, Bennett. Thank you for that overview. I was curious about, you mentioned that there's a wide spectrum of actions that businesses can take. I was curious if there's been any kind of trends or evolution in terms of maybe the kinds of actions that businesses have started off taking, and now maybe more MNCs that have been in this arena longer are now moving towards other actions, or is it, a combination of different strategies?
Melissa, thank you very much for that good question. I think we've seen a evolution in the last several years towards business understanding that taking stands can take many different forms, individually by just one company at a time, collectively by groups of companies, or collectively on a larger scale through multi-stakeholder initiatives and platforms, but also working in alignment with home country governments of the companies themselves. And an example of that is how the Fair Labor Association, the Ethical Trading Initiative, consulted closely with the EU on freedom of association and workers' rights in Cambodia, and encouraged the EU to address, as it did, those issues as it undertook a review of trade preferences for Cambodia. And as a result, the EU's trade preferences for Cambodia were limited and tied directly to progress on freedom of association in particular. So that's an important example of how we need to combine and leverage different touch points here from companies individually and collectively, but sometimes together with governments. There have been efforts underway that the Resource Center and the Business Network and I, both working with them and separately in parallel, have been involved with trying to encourage foreign ministries of different home country governments, rather, of multinationals to support defenders and civic freedoms around the world. Some of the foreign ministries that have been most engaged in those issues, both in their capitals and in different embassy posts around the world, have been Canada, the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Germany, have, among others, but those are the ones that have been principally involved, and not surprisingly, because those are foreign ministries that both have had a longstanding focus on business and human rights in general, but also on defenders in particular. And we're seeing now more instances, but behind the scenes, of how those foreign ministries and embassies are quietly but purposefully working with companies to advise and sometimes facilitate support for individual defenders, but also on tough issues. So some of those discussions I'm aware of even literally last week, this week, next week. So it's a very current phenomenon. Finally, just to finish the answer quickly, there's no one right approach, and there's a spectrum of tactics, and sometimes those tactics, those actions can be employed consecutively, but sometimes also concurrently, whether it's individual or collective actions by different companies, or whether it's private engagements quietly behind the scenes or public statements. And it really depends on the issue or the situation. So I think overall, we're seeing a greater spectrum of actions, greater flexibility, pragmatic flexibility in how those actions are undertaken. And I think that that's all to the good. Thanks for the good question.
Thank you, Bennett, and thanks very much, Clarissa, for the question. Would you mind just sharing your organization or company, just so we know?
Yeah, sure. I'm with the Chandler Institute of Governance. We're an NGO that supports capability building in governments.
Thank you so much, and thanks again for the great question. Do we have any other questions from the participants? And if you wouldn't mind, please just introducing yourselves when you ask the question, if there are any others. Okay, I don't see others jumping in right now. So perhaps I will keep us moving forward just to make sure we have some space at the end if you do want to ask questions then, and we can also come back to Bennett at that point. So what I'd like to do now is to move us along to a specific example. As I was saying, there is an example of the business network on civic freedoms and defenders as one concrete attempt to bring civil society and business together in defense of civic freedoms, and also potentially democracy writ large. So Sierra, you're one of the co-conveners of the business network in your role at the B team. The network, as we heard, is grounded in recognition that business and civil society operate and benefit from the shared space defined by common fundamental elements such as the rule of law and freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. Could you just explain to us how the network works and also what makes it a unique and powerful example of partnership between civil society and business? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our session today. As Bennett outlined in his very expert remarks, business is a key player in the civic space and in our fabric of society. The Business Network on Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders is a group of companies committed to identifying ways that businesses and society can benefit from increased support from the private sector for the protection of civic freedoms and human rights defenders. The network was launched in a time of increasing appetite for companies to be involved in the civil sectors of society and is grounded in the recognition that business and civil society operate in and benefit from a shared space, as Bennett so very, very well described to us, defined by those common fundamental elements of rule of law, freedom of expression, association, and assembly. Beyond economic elements, many businesses are publicly visible and influential in the stances that they take on social and political issues. The vision of the Business Network is that business and civil society thrive, working together in partnership with governments to create positive and enabling operating environments characterized by good governance, respect for the rule of law, and human rights, equality, and diversity. The mission of the network is to respond to and oppose the hostility towards human rights defenders, the deterioration of civic freedoms, and the closing of civic space in many parts of the globe. Initiated in 2016, this group is coordinated by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, the International Service for Human Rights, and the B Team. The Business Network offers a unique space where business, investors, and civil society, as well as human rights defenders, exchange on key topics on the human rights agenda, with a special focus on civic freedoms and defenders. This safe discussion space is intended to enhance companies' understanding of and respect for civic freedoms and for discussion of potential actions by companies in response to human rights challenges. The network is also a space for identifying best practices in response to threats to civic freedoms and human rights defenders. This includes championing innovative approaches to responsible business conduct, as well as catalyzing more consistent, principled, and effective action by companies in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I must say, building connections between business and civil society is not a linear process. The Business Network network is using the power of shared learning to encourage new conversations and action, with the goal of stretching beyond a small cluster of engaged multinationals to reach a broader sphere of companies. Last year marked the transition of the network towards further transparency in our objectives and activities, gaining additional visibility for both participating companies and NGOs. In 2021, we launched a website to give the network a public face and to provide transparency on which companies are in the network, now a total of 44 companies and institutions. Companies have been increasingly called upon to take positions on social topics. Over the years, the network has addressed salient topics such as the freedom of association, racial justice, and contemporary crisis events. For example, in a network deep dive last year, members reflected on how they can go beyond corporate statements and make commitments on racial equity, as well as identify the gaps and challenges that remain in implementation. Another example, in the face of the Myanmar military coup and security forces killings during demonstrations, the network held a session to explore the need for a strong awareness by business. To demonstrate their commitment to respect fundamental freedoms, companies were asked to suspend payments to the military, publicly reaffirm commitment to respecting fundamental freedoms, condemn threats and attacks against workers in retaliation for legitimate participation in protests, and support the welfare and safety of workers and independent media. Companies were also asked to continue their commitment to implementing the UNGPs by undertaking ongoing human rights and wider business integrity due diligence processes, as well as engaging in dialogue with civil society, and finally, explicitly calling for an end to violence and a swift resolution of the situation. Another example, massive protests that erupted in Colombia in 2021 raised the question of the role of businesses in achieving an enabling environment and protection of shared space. A network session focused on the prevention of retaliation against those who defend their rights to participation, mobilization, and free expression in demanding the respect for their economic and social rights. Members also discussed the need for coordination with national business actors and raising awareness about the wider frameworks needed to prevent attacks on defenders in those circumstances. Another tool of the business network is to matchmake companies and experts for further engagement on specific topics. One example of this was following an informative session on the situation in Hong Kong. The network was also able to set up private meetings between companies and local activists to continue discussions around freedom of assembly. Another ongoing topic for the network is company leverage. And last year, the network brought together civil society, private sector, and experts to discuss how companies can use their leverage for positive change in the civic space. Both companies and civil society depend on that shared space of accountable governance, where transparency and predictability enable sustainable and profitable growth. To encourage businesses to act, there is a need to change the perception about businesses' role. As businesses begin to label themselves as human rights friendly, as sustainable, as green, or socially responsible, they need to step up and find practical, concrete actions to promote and protect defenders in those areas. Another key recommendation is that defenders are allies and businesses should explore ways to engage with and support them. As a final example, the network has this year discussed actionable recommendations for due diligence and stakeholder engagement in a just transition. Experts have highlighted to the network the importance of strong human rights policies for every company, as well as embedded management practices of engaging with communities and stakeholders, conducting regular impact assessments with rights holders, tracking of policy implementation and results, and publicly disclosing how impacts are addressed. In the same discussion, companies also shared their own experiences with the group and took away learnings from the different approaches. All this said, I must acknowledge that there are numerous civil society and defenders groups doing incredible work and businesses who do take action on their own as well. The business network aims to uplift and complement ongoing initiatives, and we are open to engaging with new expert partners on topics that our members seek to explore. There are also cases where business has taken initiatives to act at a higher level than daily operations and strategies. For example, the B team issued a statement of principle on Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and committing to only consider resuming suspended business and investment activities in Russia when hostile operations cease and peace is restored. These are decisions that can only be taken by a company, and it is crucial that we continue to support and spread knowledge among companies on every topic if possible. The intersection of business and civil society is a clear one, affecting people's everyday lives and the frameworks of the societies that we live in. The business network will continue in its mission of collaboration and action with a vision towards thriving businesses and societies. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and I will hand back to our moderator, Anna.
Thank you very much, Sierra. Yeah, this was a great overview of not only how we work together in the network, but what we cover and the topics that we're exploring together. So now I will turn to Pam, who has experienced the network sort of from the inside as a member. So really wondering what you're taking away from it, Pam. But also, as we have heard from Bennett and from Sierra, it is crucial for companies not just to take part in joint spaces like this, but also to obviously come up with their own processes, systems that really integrate the defense of civic freedoms and of marginalized groups, as you put it in your systems, into at the core of your operations. So it would be great to hear you reflect on your journey, both as a company and as a member of the network. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Thanks so much. If we could have the slides up, please.
And as that's happening, I'll just remind to please keep it slow, because I think our interpreters were struggling a bit. So yeah, just let's keep it slow so we can all hear. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I see the slides. Thanks, Natalia, and thanks, Anna, and to Sierra and Bennett as well. I think you've well laid it out, so I think you've made my job very easy, but I would like to share a company perspective on this as well. So first of all, hello and thank you. I'm Pam Wood. I manage human rights at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with HPE, we're an edge-to-cloud IT infrastructure and solutions company. And we source and we sell around the world. And for us, respecting human rights is a core value at HPE, and it's embedded in the way that we do business. If we could just click to the next slide. Great, thank you. Back when the UN introduced the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011, we established a global human rights policy with a commitment to those principles. And since that time, we've been continuously learning and building out our programs to enforce this policy. And then our latest company and value chain-wide human rights impact assessment highlighted 6 most salient human rights risks for us. And this is really how we re-envisaged how we work and how we structure our programs and our time. So on the slide here, oh, sorry, if we could just back up. Thank you. On this slide, it does show these salient risks. So if we look just very briefly, I won't spend a lot of time here, but responsible use refers to ensuring that our customers and our end users use our technology responsibly. That's very closely connected to responsible product development, ensuring that we have human rights by design in the products we develop. Most of our work to date has focused on AI ethics, thinking about artificial intelligence, which we have shared in a few other sessions here at the forum. Modern slavery and decent work remains a top priority for us. A lot that we do there, and I think this is where, I'll get to this in future slides, but this is where perhaps most of our internal lessons come from in terms of how we engage with rights holders and thinking about those. We haven't been shy as a company to say when we have found, for example, recruitment fees in our supply chain, and what we've done about them and how we've worked with all actors to ensure that remedies provided, how we ensure that workers have a voice at the very start and throughout the whole process of remedy as well has been incredibly valuable. The idea of justice by design or human rights by design or people-centered justice, which has been a key term here at the forum, applies there. Responsible minerals, pretty straightforward around conflict minerals, but thinking broader than that to OECD guidelines there. Inclusion and diversity and water use. If we click through to the next slide. Great, thank you. let me just actually, sorry, let me back up, keep on this slide. I'll just talk about one more thing that we did do. Last year, in light of these salient risks, what we did was update our human rights policy in quite a significant way. And we framed it around these risks, and we further articulated our approach around them as well. So specifically, what do we do around each of these? How do we think about these risks? How do we do more beyond just being risk-based? And we do take a UNGP approach, which is a risk-based approach, but we're trying to think of what value add we can do. And sometimes that takes the place of how to have better stakeholder engagement or rights holder engagement. What we have done within our updated policy is specifically commit to respect the rights of human rights defenders. So joining this crew of companies that Bennett had listed out, and for us starting to think about what does this mean, and what does it mean to respect the rights of human rights defenders? How can we act collectively, individually, when cases come up? What steps will we take internally as well? And for us, we see it as a real opportunity, one, to learn from civil society representatives around what matters most to them, what are the risks that they face, to learn from the experiences of other companies. And this is where last year we also joined the Business Network on Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Offenders that Sierra presented on, and it's been a great forum for us already, just to participate in advocacy that happens within that network for stronger protections for human rights defenders. So that's a collective action, as well as an immense opportunity to share what we're doing, get feedback on that, and to learn from others, and also to regularly engage with diverse stakeholders. It's not just companies who are part of that network. So it's a really helpful opportunity for us to learn as well. If we click through to the next slide, which talks about vulnerability matters, according to the UNGPs and our commitment to them through our human rights policy, we seek to prioritize risk that is highest in scale, severe harm, or irreversible. And reputable studies, of course, have proven that women, children, migrants, students, defenders, and ethnic minorities are often most at risk, or more likely to suffer severe harm. So we've engaged extensively in progressing our practices related to two of those groups, and that's migrant workers and our student worker standards. We have specific standards that have paved the way in the electronics industry, and we seek to apply our learnings and how we put those standards to practice to these new areas. In addition to standards, our programmatic activities included, we found that the value of engaging stakeholders in specific areas in terms of design of our process and our programs and remedy has been incredibly helpful. So worker voice remains a key priority in the space of our supply chain work. But looking forward, we decided to be more intentional about how do we apply this vulnerable groups lens to other groups and across all our work, not just supply chain. So to start, we engaged various stakeholders internally and externally, including human rights defenders, to better understand how we can embed respect for vulnerable groups into our human rights due diligence and programs, and how do we formulate a stronger approach to rights holder engagement as a whole. And this led to publication of our commitment to respect the rights of marginalized groups. So if we click through to the next slide, this gives a little bit of an intro to what the commitment is. I'll also pop shortly into the chat this link that's on the screen so you don't have to type all of those letters in. But essentially what the document does is it details our commitment to respect individuals who are most vulnerable to harm or most at severe risks in our operations, as I mentioned, in our value chain, or in the deployment of our products, which for us is where much of our new thinking is coming. It builds upon our global human rights policy, so it further articulates our understanding of these vulnerabilities. We describe what HP does at the moment to address these heightened risks, and it highlights how we plan to improve, both in mitigating risks and engaging stakeholders. And finally, it calls out, for example, some of the extra challenges. So what happens, for example, if an individual exhibits characteristics of more than one group. This intersectionality between groups also needs to be better understood. If we click through to the next slide, this is a very, very reduced summary of the document as a whole. So you'll see a snapshot of these historically marginalized groups and a couple bullets, one where we call it one of the risks that we list in our commitment, and then a few examples of our approach to addressing those risks as well. So let me just quickly, before I move on, I'll put in the chat field, in the chat here, bear with me, a link to this in case there are questions going forward. But as we continue, if we stay on the human rights defenders slide, that's great. Oh, sorry. Yes, you're in a good spot. We align our definition of human rights defenders with that of the UN, and this is largely because of the UNGPs really underpinning all of our human rights work. So people who individually or with others act to promote or protect human rights. And we want to formally recognize the immense risk that human rights defenders take. And for us, a really meaningful report was the one that Anna and Bennett had worked on, this shared space report that Bennett gave an overview of. Really the 604 attacks on human rights defenders working on business-related issues in 2020 is just such a powerful number and really concerning. We encourage internally our employees and externally any stakeholder who engages with us, be that a worker further down in our supply chain, someone in a community, to raise concerns through one of our many reporting channels. And we take allegations seriously. We have a policy of no retaliation. So we hold people accountable when we find misconduct, we investigate, and as per our policy, never tolerate that retaliation for those who speak up honestly and in good faith. Beyond this, we seek to proactively engage with rights holders. We find that very helpful. And I mentioned earlier workers as a great example of when we engage more with workers in our supply chain, we start to better understand their needs and they can inform our policies, our programs, our priorities, and our approaches in a very, very helpful way. So we do believe human rights defenders could provide that valuable insight too into other challenging areas in the human rights space or environmental issues as well. We have been working, for example, recently with some NGOs through our regular engagements, and in the rare event when specific risks are identified, we seek, so both proactively and reactively to understand really what matters most and get folks involved in the process. One very quick example, in 2019, we established a volunteer program where we partnered with small NGOs who are addressing trafficking or forced labor in communities around the world. And we saw that primarily as a way that we could volunteer our time, give donations, and also support possibly with our professional skills to help these usually small organizations have a bigger impact in their community. But what we found actually is with many of these NGOs, we keep an ongoing dialogue, and they've really provided helpful tips and ideas around how we can improve our own programs internally. If we click through to the next slide, and I believe this will be my last slide, but looking specifically, sorry, where are we at now? Great, promotion of civic freedoms. Looking at what we've done as of late. So for us, we're trying to understand how we will best engage and support this and honor this shared space. And what does that look like for us? Of course, there'll be, if specific issues come out, or if we see a need for us to engage further or better. So for example, we engaged with many around the development of this commitment that I introduced. But also we see opportunities such as through the network to sign on to joint statements. For example, last year, a joint statement that we published that calls for inclusion of meaningful and safe stakeholder engagement in human rights due diligence. It gets into detail around how, such as providing an opportunity for individuals to speak out without fear of retaliation, that rights holders should be consulted, and that they should be consulted throughout various stages of the human rights due diligence process. And if we becomes more powerful and easier for us to engage all of our partners if that is placed into regulation as well. So we do find that helpful. I'll stop there just so that we can have some time for any further questions, but really appreciate all of the sharing so far in this session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bam, for giving such a clear example of not only how you managed to make this central to your own operations, but then also how you find opportunities to act collectively. And thanks so much for sharing all of this. So I think at this stage, I would like to see if there are any ideas from our audience in terms of, be it questions or just reflections you might have. What does this conversation spark in you? We know it's quite an innovative discussion for many potentially. There's not that many people involved yet, and so we're always looking for new ideas, new voices, including from from the legal profession, which I know is very represented in this space. So yeah, wanting to see if there are any questions or even just thoughts or comments from any one of you.
I'm happy to just share one quick additional comment, which is during the Ginsburg Legacy plenary this morning, Cheryl, I feel, had quite a powerful statement. I don't know if it was meant to come out as such a powerful statement, but it impacted me quite a bit and relates to what we're talking about here. And she said, learning happens when you are put in a profoundly uncomfortable space. And so to Bennett's point, you know, for companies, it can be very uncomfortable, but perhaps it's a needed space to be in at times.
And I would add very quickly to that good point that from Pam, that we've seen a lot of impetus the last several years for companies to take stands on civic freedoms issues, I think we could call them that, coming internally from employees. And just thinking back, you know, to the whole history of the business and human rights movement, and my own perspective, having first gotten into it in the very late 1990s when I was at the State Department, I can say categorically that the primary drivers were international campaigning NGOs, and to a lesser extent, the original core socially responsible investors. And they've remained the drivers well through most of the 2010s. You know, Global Witness, Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace, Amnesty International, Oxfam, on a whole range of issues around corporate accountability, business, and human rights. But what struck me has been the emergence and in some ways surge in the last several years of employee activism, particularly but not exclusively coming from the tech sector, particularly but not exclusively coming from American companies. I've seen it in extractives. There was a huge impetus internally from ExxonMobil, gay and straight employees alike, a dozen years ago, to finally get that company to commit to no discrimination against employees on the basis of sexual orientation. That came from internally. I remember because I was involved as Calvert working with the Human Rights Campaign and the AFL-CIO, but the main push came internally. And we've seen the pressure that's been put on Facebook, by Google, by Microsoft, companies that do a lot of positive good in civic space in many arenas, and yet have been challenged by employees, especially in the U.S., for example, on relationships with the immigration service during the Trump administration, in terms of how families and children were separated at the U.S.-Mexican border, and there was a lot of protests within companies. So I think that we need to continue to be aware that as not just millennials, but Generation Z and those coming even more, even younger people coming behind them, increasingly want to work, and not just want, demand that their employers have reasonably decent values. And we're seeing this push, and we just saw it just a couple months ago with Disney employees pushing their CEO to take a stand against the state of Florida's law that was so explicitly and terribly anti-gay. So we're going to continue to see this push come from inside companies. And Pam, you know this well, being at HP. I don't think HP has really felt this pressure. You've been on the progressive edge of a lot of these issues, but you sure see it in your industry.
Thank you, Bennett. And yeah, actually, I was gonna reflect on or turn to Pam as well, wondering if you see those same kind of drivers or catalysts, like both externally and internally. Are there any you would add to the list? What's been your reflection on what pushes this agenda forward?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Definitely all of the things that Bennett just listed. None, I think, more than the other. So it's maybe just that right mix of everything kind of coming together at the same time. So I've noticed increasing number of questions around what our approach is on human rights, and that comes from employees, it comes now from investors, it comes from partners, customers, suppliers. It's really great. There's more of a interest in understanding that and showing and allowing me to signal to our board how important these are. So, have spoken to some of these stakeholders with the chair of our board, which is amazing to have that kind of leadership involvement in these issues. At the same time, absolutely, there's a new kind of territory where businesses are thinking about, geopolitical matters and historically where we as businesses would not speak out, how might we want to, because something may really align with our values, and if we speak out, that can help influence change. Maybe we should be doing more of this, and maybe it's not just reactive at times. So and Russia is a great example. I'm also very interested to hear of and see what happens now. We very quickly reached out to protect and support all of our employees, give them pay in advance, and shut our operations or suspend all of our shipments and our sales. And just recently, we've come back and said, actually, not just a suspension, let's just exit the country. So thinking through maybe for future events, might we have a different approach? How will that look elsewhere? How will we collectively learn from these kinds of very large world events or societal topics as well?
A quick further comment. I was really struck by Pam just mentioning that she's engaged directly on human rights issues with the board there at HPE. That is still more the exception than the rule, particularly in corporate America, less the exception in Europe. And I want to just call attention to a new report that was launched just last week at Davos by the World Economic Forum on boards and human rights oversight, making the case that there needs to be stronger overall corporate governance of human rights risks and responsibilities, and that boards have a particularly critical role to play alongside C-suite executives and corporate staff and operations people around the company. So I commend that. And, in a time when companies are now under greater pressure internally from employees, externally from investors, from politicians, from NGOs, to take stands on issues, local, domestic, geopolitical. More and more, these are issues that are not just CEO, but board level. This is where we are now in the third decade of the 21st century. The genie is out of the bottle. And I think that companies are well advised to elevate their strategic focus to the very highest levels of decision making and oversight.
Thank you, Bennett. And maybe just staying on this kind of forward-looking trajectory for a second, I would like to first turn to Sierra and ask you to maybe share, just for those that might be interested in how others can get involved in the business network, be it companies or civil society. So if you could share maybe briefly on that. And then for the last few minutes, I would just want to see from all of you if you could identify just any ideas you might have for next steps. So is there anything that you feel is needed that could push this agenda forward? And here I would challenge us to think if any, if sort of this forum, if the World Justice Forum can be a space in some way next year and going forward to evolve this agenda. So that would just be my my final question for you all. But first, over to Sierra to just comment on how others can get involved in the business network. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. I should say the business network is open to companies who wish to join. It's a non-cost initiative. And what we ask is that companies come with a willingness and an intention to respect human rights defenders in civic space. And that's really the baseline. We know that a lot of different companies are at different stages in their journey, and we absolutely want to accompany companies in their journeys and really encourage that learning element as well. So we do have a website, which I believe Anna was able to put into the chat. We do have a contact page on that website. If you are interested, please do go ahead and reach out to us. That hits our inbox directly, and we'd be more than happy to talk to you about becoming a member. A very similar process for any civil society organizations who would like to be in touch with us and to have conversations. We, in the form of our sessions on specific topics, do often invite civil society speakers and experts. So if you feel that you are in a good position where you'd like to be able to interact in one of those sessions, please do reach out and we can start a conversation on how to engage with you. Thank you, Anna, for putting that link into the chat as well. I'll hand back to you, Anna, and then we can talk next steps and future goals.
Thank you very much, Sierra, for laying out how others can get involved. And as we said, you're all welcome to get in touch with us so that we can continue taking steps forward together. And on that, just handing it back to Bennett for some reflections on these potential next steps. This is just blue skies thinking, and we're imagining here what this might look like. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Anna. And this has been a real pleasure sharing this platform with you as well as Pam and Sierra. I want to single out the legal profession, lawyers, for just playing such an important role. And in the past on these issues, not always a positive role. Lawyers often tell company clients, whether we're the in-house bosses, what they can't do rather than what they can or should do. And I think that we've made progress. I say this as a non-lawyer, but as one who's worked closely with law firms as well as in-house counsel through my whole career. And I just want to call attention to the fact that the Shared Space Under Pressure report was endorsed by the American Bar Association in August of 2019, and the ABA, in a resolution that passed unanimously, called attention to the report in general, and in particular, it commended the decision-making framework set forth by the report, but also the emphasis on the companies, the importance of companies weighing the costs of inaction as well as action. And lawyers often caution, as they should. Of course they should. But the endorsement from the ABA was really encouraging because it was a clear statement from at least the American legal community that defending civic space, supporting human rights defenders is not only legitimate, but important and indeed necessary in certain circumstances. There's been some attention to the report, but these issues more generally on the part of the International Bar Association as well. And I think that the Business Network and all of us, have work to do to try to promote this agenda more actively through the legal world, through the Association of General Counsels, for example, which is a very important body here. So, and then that leads me to a final point, which is, and it's an internal point, but with profound external implications and consequences. And that is that when it comes to civic freedoms and a macro national or geopolitical level rule of law in the international community, or micro situations around threats to individual human rights defenders, the companies really need to look at these problems and opportunities in an integrated fashion. Lawyers must be at the table, but so too should be human rights experts. So too should be human resources people. So too should be, in conflict situations, the security people. So too should be, of course, government and public relations and communications professionals. But these are highly complex, often very sensitive, politically sensitive issues that really require a cross-functional approach within companies, and they also require high-level decision-making and oversight, C-suite and board together. And I'll just end on a personal note, and that is that I cut my teeth early in my career in the mid-'80s to the early '90s, working in the corporate headquarters of GE, the General Electric company, which was a great beast of the corporate world globally, then to much lesser extent now. And I can tell you that these issues were barely even understood 3 and 4 decades, three plus decades ago when I was there. Now these issues are front and center. They're headline issues, whether it's in a Russia-Ukraine context, a China context, an American US context. I neglected to mention in my opening remarks the unprecedented historic intervention of corporate America and Wall Street in insisting on a peaceful transfer of power after the 2020 presidential election. These issues are now absolutely front and center, and we need the legal profession, we need corporate decision makers, board directors, top, bottom, inside out, to work together to be responsible and to be accountable. And without this shared space, whatever we want to call it, rule of law, accountable governance, civic freedoms, we will have no prosperity, no equality, no democracy, no human rights in this world of ours.
Thank you, Bennett. Hard to follow that, but I will pass to Sarah to see if you'd like to add any further thoughts on next steps, and then pass to Pam before we will unfortunately need to close.
Sure, thanks, Anna. I have in mind a couple of more practical next steps, and I would say this is primarily from the business side. I'm sure Pam can elaborate on this in more depth, but I would really highlight the need for commitments, public commitments from companies on human rights defenders, and civic space. The element of visibility is really key in showing leadership to others who are making similar choices, and also giving an accountability mechanism for stakeholders to engage with. Something to come back to and say, we did commit to this and we told you that we have, and we continue to stick to that. And the next step beyond a public statement of commitment, and which would really accompany a real policy, would be to develop decision-making frameworks within the company for how to address certain situations, and if possible, also how to deal with unprecedented situations if there's a way to figure out an escalation method that would apply more generally. And I'll leave it there, and I think Pam will have a lot more to say on that as well.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for pointing out some really practical opportunities and next steps. And Pam, over to you.
Actually, Sarah, well said. I'm just plus oneing everything that she added. But I think maybe then I'll speak more to this forum specifically. It's been really great. I've been here in person all week, and it's been we've been grappling what I've found as someone who comes at it from a human rights world, coming into this world of justice by design and mostly lawyers, as well as a number of folks working at the grassroots level from around the world who are here, government actors, in a small amount of business, very small here. It's been really interesting to see how our human rights terms of access to remedy, being called access to justice, people-centered approaches to justice. For us, it's, rights holder informed processes and approaches. And it's the same things that we're talking about. So I think it just opened my eyes, this forum, to the greater space and the degree of diversity of folks interested in this area, supportive of this area, speaking, although maybe different language and terms, speaking the same talk, while pursuing the same interests. So this idea of rule of law, people-centered justice, human rights by design, they're also complementary. And I think there's maybe a broader world for us human rights folks to engage in and to form partnerships in many ways.
Thanks, Pam. I think it's such a good summary of what we've experienced today here. We're very grateful for the space that we had to share about our initiative. We think that there is a way to collaborate going forward with the forum, perhaps through another, maybe a more intimate working session, even within the confines of the business network. So just thank you all for being here. Thanks for giving us the space. And as Pam said, there are more links that we can build and more understanding of each other that we can create through working together. So thank you for the session, and we're going to wrap it up here. Thanks for being here.